Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah wa alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Very grateful for those allusions to my excursion across the Atlantic yesterday. Actually, it's no sacrifice at all. Imam Ibn al-Farid says, لولا شذاها ما اهتديت لحانها. But for the fragrance of the wine, I would not have found my way to the tavern. It's always a privilege and a great honor to come to this gathering. I suppose what I'm going to try and do is to add a few reflections, some of them fairly extended, hopefully not too extended. I take it that I have about half an hour, to what I was trying to get at earlier today. And dangle before you the suggestion that if we are not just to plod on as we are at present in our Western diaspora, but to be heard, which is our religious duty, we have to consider the fact that at present we have lamentably failed. And we have failed quite simply and obviously because we are not tuned in to the frequency of the Western ear. What is being broadcast from the minbars up and down the Muslim communities of the West is tuned into the frequency of hearers or microphones, as it were, back in the home countries in Egypt or Pakistan or wherever. Such sermons work very well and legitimately there, but here they have very little to say that can really catch the attention of people who are born in the West or have been shaped by Western ways of looking at things. And what we need to do is not demand that the West change its frequencies on which it operates, because they're not going to fiddle around in order to hear us. They couldn't care less. If we wish to be heard, we have to change the frequency on which we're broadcasting, and then perhaps some kind of communication will take place. 99%, I fear, of our mosque imams have not yet got that message. And perhaps one of the principal ways in which we need to adjust the frequency is the way in which we speak about the founder of our religion, Alaihi Wasallam. We know that the Blessed Prophet has been interpreted over the last 100 years or so, in particular, in more ways than has ever been interpreted before, in some ways quite aberrant fashions. Some have regarded him as some kind of pioneer socialist. Some thought he was an Arab nationalist, or a monarchist, or history's first Democrat, or whatever. People have made him in their own image quite frequently. And none of these, I fear, are really on the wavelength of the modern West. What we need is to find frequencies in which our religion can broadcast, and which modernity can hear. Let me suggest now a few of those possible frequencies. As you'll note, these are actually entirely legitimate and traditional ways of speaking about him, but frequently these are ways which are nowadays neglected. Let me introduce the first of these, which is the reviving the traditional celebration of the prophetic glory as intercessor, by again having a go at these stereotypes. Christianity is the religion of love and mercy and forgiveness, etc., and Islam is the religion of law and judgment, by reflecting on the fact that on the last day, Christianity has its founder judging everyone. He is the judge. The last day, Islam has its founder as Shafi'ullah, as the intercessor, standing at the very brink of hellfire, urging humanity back and praying to his Lord, Rabbi Sallim, Sallim. This is the image we have, and that doesn't fit at all well with the conventional Western or Christian put-down of Islam as religion of judgment and of the law. When it comes to the crunch, that's not how it will be. So, reverse their stereotypes by looking at the doctrine of the Shifa'a. You can buy Islamic tapes nowadays which are about Rasulullah, and they talk about how nice he was to children, etc., etc. And very rarely now do they mention this attribute, because people of a Salafi disposition in particular, despite the fact that the Shifa'a is well and truly mapped out in the Hadith, seem to be a little bit nervous about the idea that we will ask Rasulullah Sallallahu, Alaihi, to plead our case on the latter day. But for the fact that it's there in black and white in the Hadith, they would certainly brand as mushrik anybody who adhered to such a doctrine. So they have to shut up. Let me just remind you of this traditional doctrine by reading you some lines from a poem by Mullah Abdul-Rahman Jāmī, again significant in the Naqshbandi tradition. Died in the late 15th century by the Western calendar. And I recently shared this poem with the Anglican Bishop of Oxford. Sometimes sprinkle over different kinds of Christians, different kinds of Islamic literature, just to see what works and what doesn't work. And he was really transfixed and amazed by this. Clearly, it was on his frequency. What he says is, "Bestow your generous attention, O seal of the prophets, for greatly bereaved is the world since your demise, O messenger of God. You who are indeed last of the messengers and their seal. How can you ignore us when drowned in wretchedness and ill of fortune are we? Through your evergreen freshness, O dearest one, grace now this world, and from your restful sleep awake to fill us with guiding light. Lift now your countenance from within your Yemeni cloak, for your blessed face is the very life and light of day. Turn for us the darkness of our sorrowful night into blessed light of day, and crown for us our day with successful accomplishments. And now do don your fragrant-smelling garments, and on your head the white turban do place. Let your dark and precious locks of hair hang down, that their shade may fall upon your blessed feet. Wrap your feet in your sandals from mountainous Ta'if, and make their straps bind our souls to you. The entire universe desires to be spread out for your feet, and sincerely wishes for the honor that you tread upon her. Come forth from your sepulchre into the prophetic mosque, that we may kiss and lay our heads under the feet where you do tread. O messenger, grant refuge and help for the needy, and console the hearts of those filled with love for you. Sinners are we, drowned in the sea of our iniquity, yet great is the thirst of our endeavor to follow your way. How wonderful would be that day when to your abode I shall come and refresh my eyes with the dust of Medina. When in loving madness, cheering heart and overflowing yearning I shall walk around your grave and the green dome. To your honoured pulpit shall I go, and rubbing there on my face, gone pale for love of you, that golden it shall become. Then to the place where you prayed to stand in prayer, fulfilling my heart's desires, and standing where you did stand, washing your footsteps in streams of my blood. And though now my body does not appear in your presence, yet grateful am I to God that my soul is there for me. In spite of our many heinous sins, may God grant you to intercede for us, for otherwise we are lost. May you arrive on the plane of reckoning while we, encircled by our sins, look on as you bend your head in prayer, calling out, "Forgive my people, God, forgive them." And may through your glorious efforts and the blessings of the holy ones, this Jāmī also be included among those who are accepted and pardoned. An entirely traditional idiom, and one that speaks beautifully to the modern Western soul. Second of my categories, my possible frequencies, is the Rasul Alaihi as personal guide. As we know, Rasul Alaihi in his Medinan sanctuary is not dead, but he lives in the state known as Barzakh, the mysterious isthmus between this world and the next. In our literature, we frequently find sometimes those lyrical and beautiful descriptions of the appearance of the Blessed Prophet in dream states to spiritual seekers in order to provide guidance. Let me give you a modern example from the diary of a recent Sufi khalwa. As I pray, all at once an image is before my eyes, sharp and clear. I see Muḥammad, peace be upon him, sitting in a white Arabian gown. I see slender, fine hands, powerful with a slightly tanned skin color, and similar feet, bare but for brown leather sandals. I see no face or head. It's as if I'm too close to see it. But I see myself. As I gaze at myself sitting there, I become younger and younger before my eyes. Finally, I am once again the little girl with braids and pigtails that once, a long time ago, I used to be. I ask him to show me his heart, to teach me the way of the heart, the way of poverty. He opens his garment to show his chest, and his heart is like a gleaming, reflecting mirror, like an indescribably powerful, silvery white sun that burns up and destroys everything in its cool fire. It seems unbearable and at the same time irresistible. It turns every superfluous thing to ashes, burns everything empty and clean. I stayed there for a long time, right in front of this glittering, all-penetrating light source, secure, kept safe. My third category is the Rasulullah's moral exemplar. And my example here is a famous passage from Imam al-Ghazali's Ihya al-Ulum-ad-Dīn. The Messenger of God, Sallallahu, Alaihi, Wasallam, was the mildest of men, but also the bravest and most just of men. He was the most generous of men, so that never did a gold or silver coin spend the night in his house. If something remained at the end of the day, because he had not found someone to give it to, and night descended, he would go out and not return home until he had given it to someone in need. From what God gave him, he would take only the simplest and easiest foods, dates and barley, giving anything else away for God's sake. Never did he refuse a gift for which he was asked. He used to mend his own sandals and patch his own clothes and serve his family and help them to cut meat. He was the shyest of men, so that his gaze would never remain long in the face of another person. He would accept the invitation of a freeman or a slave and accept a gift, even if it were no more than a gulp of milk or the thigh of a rabbit, and offer something in return. He never consumed anything given as charity. He was not too proud to reply to a slave girl or a pauper in rags. He would become angered for his Lord, never for himself. He would cause truth and justice to prevail, even if this led to difficulties for himself and for his companions. Fourth of my categories is as prototype of the Sufi. Sufism is a very positive word in the West. People have more or less amputated it from its Islamic moorings. I'm talking about the endless proliferation of pseudo-Sufi, quasi-New Age movements that are now apparently almost universal. We know that Imam Jalāl Rūmī is now said to be the most widely read poet in America. In these New Age versions into which he has been translated, the founder of the religion, Alaihi, has frequently been excluded, censored out, largely because the translators want to make money, and America very typically has a vehement, unthinking dislike of Islam. However, in the original of Rūmī, the founder is there triumphantly, not as some prudent nod to exoteric ulama, but as Rūmī's ideal, the perfect man, the astrolabe of God, the model of the spiritual wayfarer, and of the perfected saint. Rūmī says, "This is my beloved, this my physician, this my tutor, this my cure. هذا حبيبي, هذا طبيبي, هذا أديبي, هذا دوائي." His life is a series of icons, the contemplation of which transforms the observer. He is the philosopher's stone who transmutes leaden hearts into gold. Some of the most ravishing passages in Rūmī are those which describe the Isra and the Mi'raj, recalling how Jibreel alayhi salam couldn't accompany him into the ultimate presence of God. And of course, this most mystical moment in the Seerah is used by Rūmī as the archetype of the Sufi's flight. So Rūmī writes, "When Muḥammad passed the Lot tree and Gabriel's observation post, station and limit, he said to Gabriel, 'Come, fly after me.' He replied, 'Go, go, I am not your match.' Again he said, 'Come, O burner of veils, I have still not reached my zenith.' He replied, 'O my sweet glory, if I fly beyond this limit, my wings will burn.'" Now Gabriel for Rūmī, and really for the Sufi tradition thereafter, represents the intellect, which according to this ancient familiar theme of Sufism, cannot attain unto God. Only the Buraq, the mysterious steed of Rasulullah Sallallahu, Alaihi, Wasallam, which is none other than love itself, can make the final journey beyond the mysterious Sidrat al-Muntaha. Now, even more miraculously, after this sacrifice of the intellect, the Rasul Alaihi Salatu Wasallam returns to the world. Here again, he becomes precisely the prototype of the Muslim saint. He returns to creation. So this becomes, obviously, for the people of tariqah, the original paradigm of baqa, subsistence after fana, or annihilation. Now for Rūmī, his prophetic work, dealing with the hassles of Makkah and Quraysh, is but burden, torment and suffering, because that's the price of love in the ascetical and mystic life. For Rūmī, the whole geography of the Seerah, beginning with the travails in Mecca, actually has significance as milestones along the spiritual journey. He writes, "Did not the chosen one go to travel towards Medina, found a kingdom and become the ruler of 100 lands?" In Rūmī, consistently, Mecca is the birthplace, the realm of attachments, which the Sufi has to leave behind for the deserts along the way, finally to reach the verdant oasis which prefigures heaven and which becomes his spiritual kingdom, a place of transformed life in community and fellowship, a kind of blissful garden-like anticipation of eternity. But the Rasul Alaihi salatu wasalam returns to Mecca to smash the idols and to bring news of the kingdom to those of his people who had not accompanied him and who still lived in shadows. So for Rūmī, the whole hijrah to Medina is the type of the purgative life. The struggle to establish Allah's order in the oasis city is inseparable from the struggle to establish it in the heart which it represents. And this again takes us back to his glory as the Khalifa, because in Medina he has this struggle in which he manifests some of the divine names of rigor as well as the divine names of beauty. God forgives, the Rasul forgives. God judges, so does the Prophet. So Rūmī says, the Prophet is God's scales on earth on which good and evil are judged. He is like the ark of Sayyidina Nuh. Some will not be saved and must perish. And he says that the Quran, in the hands of the Rasul, is like the rod of Moses, Asa Musa, which is guidance for the believers, pointing them towards the promised land, but which is also a serpent which consumes people guilty of pride and unbelief. So the Rasul, alayhi salatu wasalam, like Musa, has enemies who represent archetypes of human distraction, egotism, a demonic scuttling away from the light. But even as he represents the Jalāl and administers justice, he himself is entirely detached. Because as Rūmī says, he is like the moon, and his companions are the stars, and the heavenly bodies are not obstructed in their journey by the barking of dogs. As perfect man, the Prophet ﷺ does manifest God's rigor. But while Rūmī accepts this as proof of his truly theomorphic nature, the Prophet ﷺ for Rūmī is primarily the treasurer of Allah's mercy. Because after all, while Allah is wrathful, he has also told his Prophet that my mercy outstrips my wrath. So Rūmī says, Muḥammad has come as a mercy to the world, rahmatan lil alameen. And from the ocean of absolute certainty, he grants pearls to the inhabitants of this world, peace to the fishes. Let me now move on to the second half of my talk. I've sketched some of the multiple facets of the founder's perfection, which might, and I think will, appeal to those who listen carefully in the West. But the other side of that equation has to be, what in fact are they looking for, primarily? What is their idea of an ideal human type? Who are they looking for? Are they looking for all of these types that I've mentioned? Well, it seems to me that one of the most hopeful things that have happened over the past 100 years is that the West's idea of the ideal human type, and I'm talking about serious, conscientious people, has changed quite drastically. And you could define that transformation in two terms, borrowing from familiar terms in psychology, eros and thanatos, love and death. The perfect human being traditionally in Christian Europe was celibate, and the body was something to be fought. Now, of course, the reverse is the case. The body is almost God. The undraped human form seems to be around us everywhere in the modern West. A more complete inversion would be hard to imagine. Second transformation in this area of thanatos, or death. Traditionally, in Christian Europe and in Christian America, the ideal was held up as being the pacific, non-violent, turn-the-other-cheek Jesus of the New Testament. That, I think, is no longer the case. True, there are many devout Christians who do still believe that. There is a pacifist minority amongst them. But perhaps because of the experience of Europe during 2 world wars, the idea of conscientious objection and pacifism is regarded as being morally deeply problematic. So we find that the ideal figure for a lot of even Christian theologians nowadays is becoming that of Sayyidina Musa, and the model for action is that of the Exodus. So, for instance, Archbishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa writes, "I will want to show that the Christian Bible and the gospel of Jesus Christ is subversive of all injustice and evil, oppression and exploitation, and that he is the liberator God of the Exodus who leads his people out of every kind of bondage." It's a very new way for Christians to talk. And the Exodus theme characteristically seems conspicuous here rather than the cross. A discrete but important redistribution of stress, which in the case of the Latin American liberation theologians has led to some of the most serious tensions within the modern Catholic Church. I suspect that this is the birth pang of a really new possibility in Christianity, which has to render intriguing for Christians its very glorious anticipation in Islam. Because the Hijrah stands already precisely as an Exodus event. It's a sign of liberation, not only from the world, as in Rūmī, but from the tyrants who abuse it. Of course, one of the commonest Muslim claims about the Bible is that it predicts a new Moses. So we read in Deuteronomy, "I will raise up for them a prophet from among their brethren like unto thee, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he will speak unto them all that I shall command him." It's a new Exodus prophet who is foretold, who will bear a literally inspired scripture. It's one of the clearest foretellings of Rasulullah Sallallahu, Alaihi in the Hebrew Bible. So, our Exodus event is something that can now be taken very seriously by religious minds in the West in a way that hitherto it certainly wasn't. Our Exodus event is not an illusory, profane liberation, as some Christian critics have described the Hijrah. Like the earlier Exodus, our Exodus event leads not just out into the desert, but to Jerusalem. It leads on to Jerusalem and the construction of a place of God's glory. Many of you, if you saw CNN this morning, will have seen that place of God's glory and the suffering to which it's now being subject. Now, the Aqsa Mosque, the Dome of the Rock, really can be seen as the third temple. Blue and gold, splendid edifices offering to the former religions of Jerusalem something of the heavenly blessings that were brought down by the Mi'raj. And that building stood at the middle of a brand new third empire. Those buildings all have a particular deliberate rhetoric, and that's one of the points they're making. It was even made explicit by Mehmed the Conqueror when in 1453 he conquered Constantinople and actually claimed the mantle of the Byzantine rulers. But the Third Empire, in this sense, in my sense, was Mosaic, because it acknowledged the possibility of sacred kingship and sacred sexuality, which the Byzantines couldn't manage. So you could say that it represents the finest dimensions of the Hebrew Bible. And this is why we are not anti-Semitic in the sense that Christianity traditionally is anti-Semitic. We have quarrels with Judaism, of course, as we have quarrels with other religions. We regard them as abrogated. However, we're not anti-Semitic in the traditional Western sense. Why? Because Islam is actually, in a sense, the glorious triumph of that story. The story of Hebrew monotheism, the martial prowess of the Hebrew Bible, the tender sexuality of the Hebrew Bible. We continue those things. Under St. Paul, and Paul's Christianity, which claims to consummate Judaism by simply negating it, by saying it was rubbish, an anti-religion established in order to throw into sharper relief the true religion of Christ. Islam's overtaking of the Hebrew message is also its universalization. Now, the third empire that the Sahaba created forms the subject of a remarkable meditation by the Norwegian playwright Henrik Ibsen. He wasn't explicitly referring to Islam, but in the context of what I'm saying here, which is about how the Western mind is moving towards a model of human perfection that we can fill with our founder, it's a very extraordinary anticipation. Ibsen wrote a play called Emperor and Galilean. He personally considered it to be his masterpiece. And here he wrestles with the commonplace 19th century problem of how to replace Christianity with a faith that would acknowledge the flesh and the need to challenge social iniquity. And the play is about a Roman emperor called Julian the Apostate, who seeks to return the world to the harmony between body and spirit, which he thought prevailed before Christianity had come along and declared war between the two. His view is that the Roman gods are actually open-minded and cultivated. They valued heroism, manhood, and willpower. The sweet lust of the flesh is celebrated by painted dancing girls and every kind of Bacchic mystery. That was the first empire. The second empire, inaugurated by Constantine and Helena, was an austere inversion of that, a world of denial, as he says, lived on the pillar where the saint awaits eternity on one leg. The heroes of the Second Empire, in fact, as Julian realizes, are not these bloodless, unpleasant, celibate ascetics, but in fact the pagans who are being slaughtered for Christ, their blood rising to him like a sweet incense. So Julian, the Roman emperor, who goes back on Christianity, back to paganism, is shown in Ibsen's play as being morally and spiritually acute. What he does is to reinstate the old pagan cults and seeks a universal reconciliation. However, Ibsen, a man who himself had flirted with Wagnerian dreams of self-realization through some kind of aversion to pagan identities, makes it clear that Julian's attempt to recreate the First Empire is doomed. The emperor finally concedes the old beauty is no longer beautiful, but the new truth is no longer true. And he becomes a pedant tyrant, deluded by his own sense of destiny, and he goes in battle with Persians in a very dramatic scene at the end of the play, a titanic battle which he actually loses. And his heart almost breaks as he realizes that neither Christianity nor paganism have worked. And he confesses this to Maximus, who's his pagan soothsayer. The dialogue runs as follows. "Tell me, who shall conquer, the emperor or the Galilean?" Maximus replies, "Both the emperor and the Galilean shall succumb, whether in our time or in hundreds of years I know not, but so it shall be when the right man comes. O fool, who have drawn up sword against that which is to be, against the third empire, in which the twin-natured shall reign." Julian says, the third empire, the Messiah, not the Jews' Messiah, but the Messiah of the two empires, the spirit and the world. And Maximus says, Logos in Pan and Pan in Logos. Now Julian realizes that he can't be that man. He's not going to be the founder of the new empire that reconciles the flesh and warriorhood and the sacred. He's been vanquished by his own delusions. He is what Ibsen calls an idealist, whereas what the world awaits, a liberative figure who is hopefully to come, is a realist. This opposition between idealism and realism doesn't have anything to do with the very technical, philosophical tussle that uses the same terms. What Ibsen means is something actually quite simple, tension between purely moral strategies. And Bernard Shaw, in his study of Ibsen, notes that according to the idealist, realism means egotism, and egotism means depravity. But in fact, the opposite is the case. Idealism is a covert realization of oneself, self as ego. It is egotism of the type that leads Peer Gynt, another figure in Ibsen's plays, to see slovenly woman riding on a pig and to regard her as a princess simply because at that moment what he needs is a princess. So idealism is nothing but romantic fancy. Hence, with hindsight, we would classify Hitler as an idealist and his Third Reich as a disastrous inversion of the Third Kingdom, which, as with the Hitlerite Julian, comes to grief on an eastern battlefield. For Ibsen, I hope you'll be patient with me here, but what I'm getting at is that these important Western thinkers are moving towards a new ideal for Europe, now that the Christian ideal and the pagan ideal don't seem to work. For Ibsen, our humanity is unearthed by a realist rediscovery of what he calls joy of life, which is repressed when we don't act, when we see sinful structures and oppression in the world, and also repressed by our repression of our own sexuality. In another of Ibsen's plays, Rosmersholm, we find a figure called Pastor Rosmer who abandons his family's political conservatism in favor of social activism and discovers a sexual nature that his conventional wife will not arouse. And for Shaw, in his commentary on this play, this country parson gropes towards self-realization by losing his Christianity and through the awareness that he must act for the consummation of his physical nature and for the ennoblement of society. So as Shaw notes, he looks at the world with some dim prevision of the Third Empire. Now Shaw, as some of you will know, an individual who had considerable interest in Islam, acknowledged the vast influence of Ibsen on his own work. And this is certainly nowhere more conspicuous than in this interesting opposition of idealism to realism. For him, pacifism, or militarism, and sexual repression were the most manifest representations of idealism. And in fact, most of Shaw's early plays are simply pegs on which to hang this tension. Of course, Shaw was aware of the inadequacy of his own free-thinking, agnostic, Fabian, socialistic response. It was not clear to him or anybody in his circle how you could achieve sexual liberation without arriving at libertinism. However, his most ambitious play, a play which I think is hugely important for Muslims, and certainly as important to him as Emperor and Galilean had been for Ibsen in holding up what the modern post-Christian European can regard as an ideal person. His supreme play was conceived as a vehicle for this kind of Shavian Superman. His biographer, Hesketh Pearson, writes as follows: "For many years, this was 1913, Shaw had been meditating a play on a prophet. The militant saint was a type more congenial to his nature than any other, a type he thoroughly sympathized with and could therefore portray with unfailing insight. In all history, the one person who exactly answered his requirements, who would have made the perfect Shavian hero, was Muḥammad." And in his diary for 1913, we find Shaw writing, "I had long desired to dramatize the life of Muhammad, but the possibility of a protest from the Turkish ambassador, or the fear of it causing the Lord Chamberlain to refuse to license such a play, deterred me." And so, as we learn, he wrote St. Joan instead, which is his play on about Joan of Arc. Now Shaw, like Ibsen, like many people in that generation, loved God, his definition of God, but was really annoyed by Christianity. He described Christianity as a growing thing that was finally suppressed by the crucifixion, which preached an atonement which was an insane vengeance bought off by a trumpery expiation. Its ideology of turning the other cheek, non-resistance, was a charter for tyrants, and usually defeated even its own purpose of establishing a space for religion. He says social salvation must come before individual righteousness is possible. Exact opposite, really, of the Christian view. So Joan of Arc, or the outline of the Prophet, Alaihi, which we can dimly read between the lines of his play, is a born leader whose voices heard from God are genuine. This is the only stage direction in Shaw which is not the prelude to the exposure of some fraud or humbug. She is, as he says, a protesting prophet, subverter, active agent of the life force, who is condemned by idealists, the church, who opposes convention but upholds the sanctity of the political virtues because, as Shaw believed passionately, government is impossible without religion. Now, the Islamic resonances are very clear in this, and we're not surprised to learn that St. John was actually composed while Shaw was copy-editing T.E. Lawrence's book, 7 Pillars of Wisdom, with its tales of Arabian derring-do. Now, this kind of 20th century convergence between Rasulullah Sallallahu, Alaihi Wasallam, the Muslim prophet, and European post-Christian ideals, the missing person in their landscape that they were looking for, has of course a lot to do with Romanticism. And there's an Enlightenment notion of the noble savage at work here, which is actually not wholly alien to the Muslim case. Medieval Christians like Aquinas had condemned what they call the garden of nature, which the Prophet ﷺ announced. Thinkers alienated in the 19th century and beyond from doctrines of original sin and the worthlessness and fallenness of the body and the world actually found his naturalism, which is probably a better word than Shaw's realism, actually rather attractive. Remember, during the Mi'raj, Jibreel alayhi salam offers Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam a cup of wine and a cup of milk. And he chooses the milk, at which the angel exclaims, Hudita lil fitra, you have been guided to the fitra, to nature, to what is primordial and natural. Because in taking nourishment from Allah directly from the natural world, rather than at one remove via a process of fermentation and corruption, Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is confirming the fully theophanic nature of the world and our ability to be reconciled to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by being reconciled to the world, which is precisely what the Christians thought couldn't happen. When you're Allah's Khalifa, that means you're the Khalifa fil ard. This incident, milk over wine, is clearly intended as a refutation of Christian sacramentalism, that the substance is something that is not of the world. It has been spiritualized through fermentation and thereby moved above the world. It has been sublimed in some sense. The Christians have their own metaphors for understanding why wine is identified with the blood of Christ. But we choose the milk. But of course the corollary of this, which is of huge contemporary importance and is one reason why Islam intrinsically speaks to the modern condition, all worried about the biosphere nowadays, is that to be at peace with the earth, one must be at peace with heaven. Anyway, I should stop. I've spoken for too long. I hope it's been clear in these various literary meanderings that we can genuinely say that the West is looking for someone, and that someone is not the Christ of the New Testament, celibate and uninterested in politics. Through people like Ibsen and Shaw and some of the great conscientious protesters of the last 100 years or so, we can see that the West is looking for another model of human perfection. The man who indeed existed, who brought into being the third kingdom, Pan and Logos, Logos in Pan, where flesh and spirit were held in harmony rather than in a state of perpetual warfare. That, I think, is a frequency on which we should be broadcasting. And that, I think, to me is the source of greatest hope. We don't notice it. We're not broadcasting on that frequency. You don't really have any idea what the West is looking for. But they are looking for Rasulullah. Last year, the Anglican Church, in one of its desperate moves in England, launched a new Christmas advertising campaign. And the posters that went up all over the country, bright red, sort of communist red, and they had the face of Che Guevara with a crown of thorns. And the slogan was, meek, mild, as if. The idea being, oh, everybody thinks Christianity is a religion for milksops and wet pacifists. In fact, Jesus was a kind of socialist figure. Well, on a certain modern reading of the Bible, yeah, he had zealot affiliations, he cleansed the temple, but that's not the traditional Christian picture. The traditional Christian image, certainly in the 19th and early 20th century in popular piety, is the Holman Hunt portrait of the light of the world. Jesus is a kind of gentle hippie wearing a silk nightie, holding up a lantern. Modern people aren't looking for that person. They certainly are not. They're looking for somebody who will get into the world, who will seek to reform the world. But they're also looking for somebody who can bring about harmony between the flesh and the spirit, which is perhaps the greatest challenge of our age, and the failure to achieve which has resulted in a chaos no less damaging than the war on the flesh that prevailed in the centuries of Christian domination. So my point is, abshiru, it's good news, because the West is looking for Rasulullah Sallallahu, Alaihi, Wasallam. It's now our duty to hold him up in all of his glory to be seen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. As we know, discipline of the soul has traditionally been done at the feet of a Shaykh. Today in Chicago, this may not be possible. Can you please, Shaykh, sketch an outline of a program that might help the youth of America to discipline the nafs? The cruder manifestations of the nafs are usually known to us when we're honest with ourselves and do muhasabah. We know the things that we have done for principled reasons, and the things we have done out of laziness or gluttony or lust or sloth or ostentation. Very frequently, I think we can tentatively trust our own intuition on certain things. The more subtle things, you do need a shaykh. Sufism is something that you can't pull out of a book. That's one reason, of course, why the detailed practices of Sufism and principles of Sufism are not explicitly sketched in the Quran and the Sunnah. As I indicated earlier, nothing that is abstractly spiritual is there in the revelation as such. It's always indicated in terms of its fruits. Wilaya defined in a certain way, ihsan defined in a certain practical way. We do have a great richness of books on Sufism in Islam, but their authors invariably wrote them on the expectation that they would be teaching manuals in teaching situations with a live shaykh. Imam al-Ghazali did not really envisage somebody walking into a bookshop on the north side of Chicago and pulling out his Kitab Riyadat al-Nafs in an English translation. We often read these books in a context that's very far from what their authors intended. That's not to say that they cannot benefit us. Clearly they can. Some people do find enormous benefit in just reading about tasawwuf, and this is a required practice in most of the turuq, that you read the basic texts of tasawwuf, the Risala of Imam al-Qushayri, Ihya al-Ulumuddin of Imam al-Ghazali, the Awarif al-Ma'arif of Imam Shahabuddin Suhrawardi, and a number of others. But really one should have a living teacher, as one should in most disciplines. I mean, even in the most exoteric disciplines, such as medicine, you don't really get to practice being a doctor just through reading books in the library. You have to attend lectures, you have to have tutorials, you have to have had some kind of apprenticeship in a hospital or so, some kind of practitioner. And it's even more the case with something like tasawwuf, which is so subtle. You have to have a shaykh. This is an obligation, and even exoteric Islam recognizes this. One of the texts that they made us memorize at Al-Azhar is the Jawharat al-Tawheed of Imam al-Laqani, which is a doctrine text. A couple of its lines, if I can remember, run وَمَالِكٌ وَسَائِرُ الْأَئِمَّةِ كَذَا أَبُو الْقَاسِمِ هُدَاةُ الْأُمَّةِ فَوَاجِبٌ تَقْلِيدُ حَبْرٍ مِّنْهُمُ كَذَا حَكَى الْقَوْمُ بِلَفْظٍ يُفْهَمُ, which means, and Malik and the other Imams, similarly Abu al-Qasim, the guides of the Ummah, it is wajib to follow, taqleed, learned man amongst them. This is how it has been handed down. So what Imam al-Laqani is saying here is that just as it is obligatory for a non-mujtahid to follow a madhab, because if you try and work things out for yourself, you'll mess up. Similarly, when you try and emulate the inward sunnah, the inward greatness of the Rasul Alaihi salatu wasalam, which is the purpose and the pride of tasawwuf, you also need to follow an imam. Here he says Abu al-Qasim, which means Abu al-Qasim al-Junayd, Qaddasallahu sirrahu, who is Sayyid al-Ta'ifa, the great exemplary Sufism of our early Middle Ages. So traditional Azhari Islam says it's wajib. فَوَاجِبٌ تَقْلِيدُ حَبْرٍ مِّنْهُمُ. What do you do in a place like Chicago? Well, you remember that Allah's generosity is infinite, and that there is no gift that leads to the state that he wishes for us that is never accessible. But we have to pray for it. The shuyukh are not geographically restricted. Their means of praying for their disciples, of conveying spiritual benefits upon their disciples, has nothing to do with geographical distance. It's possible to have a shaykh, to have a full relationship with a shaykh whom one has never met and whose existence one does not suspect. Many cases of this in tasawwuf, and when the meeting finally comes, it's just a zahir confirmation for the sake of the authenticity of the silsila, if one goes on to perpetuate a silsila. Very many cases of this. Imam Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi was a great example. Mawlana Khalid al-Baghdadi and a number of others. Because the zone of operation of the wali is not limited by the 4 points of the compass. It's to do with the barzakh. And the world of the barzakh is something about which we cannot imagine very much, but it's known in the Hadith that we can have visions when we sleep of those who are not physically close to us, of the Rasul Alaihi Wasallam. Man ra'ani fil manami faqad ra'ani haqqa. Whoever sees me in a dream has seen me in truth. You see him truly, although he is in Medina al-Munawwara, because in the barzakh geography doesn't really exist. So being in Chicago really is, literally speaking, if you like, neither here nor there. The point is the ta'alluq and the tawajjuh. How do you explain and convince someone to do Miladun Nabi and benefits? Yes, I'm sorry. The arguments for the Mawlid are well known amongst the ulama. You'll find them in Ibn Kathir, for instance, who has a famous Mawlid, still sometimes done in Syria. In classical Sunni usul, clear distinction is made between two categories of innovation, positive and negative. A negative innovation essentially refers to any practice introduced into Islam that does not form part of it, which the scholars such as Ibn al-Salah and al-Izz ibn Abd al-Salam and the others unanimously regard as being that which contradicts something that is necessarily known to be part of the deen. Ma'lumun min ad-Dīn bid-darura. What conflicts with that is a bid'ah to be repudiated, and that's the bid'ah that is in hellfire. But this doesn't mean that there cannot be Muslim culture, Muslim civilization, that the religion cannot flower in its various ethnic particularities, that methods cannot be devised by the faithful ulama to inculcate necessary virtues such as the love of the Prophet Alaihi Wasallam. Because the hadith says, Man sanna fil islami sunnatan hasana falahu ajruha wa ajru man amila biha ila yawm al-qiyamah. Whoever introduces into Islam a good sunnah, he has the reward for it and the reward of all who act according to it until the yawm al-qiyamah. And on the basis of this traditional Sunni understanding, we have most of what we today recognize as Sunni Islam. Much of the vocabulary of Islam was not known to the Sahaba. They didn't know the word Aqidah, for instance. You won't find it in the collections of Hadith in its contemporary sense. They didn't know about the rules and regulations of Arabic grammar. And yet you can't do tafsir and Hadith studies unless you have technical terms of Arabic grammar in order to unpack the prophetic sayings. So many of the absolutely indispensable knowledges of the religion are post-prophetic and post-Sahaba. And the celebration of Mawlid, which came in 6th and 7th centuries of our era, is in this category, this honourable category. And it's a particularly important and honourable innovation in that it inculcates the most fundamentally important of all Muslim emotions, which is the love of Rasulullah Sallallahu, Alaihi, Wasallam. Not one of you has iman, he said, until I am more beloved to him, ahabba ilayhi, than his family, his parents and all mankind. And this love is something that sometimes is conspicuously absent in many Muslim contexts, tragically. And the function of the Mawlid is to revive, to fan the flames of this love. And its Islamic legitimacy is determined by that maqsad, by that purpose. If it serves that purpose, then it becomes not just legitimate, but religiously necessary. Okay, alhamdulillah.